Hi everybody, David Parsons here. This is Nostalgia Trap. I hope things are going well in your world. Today we've got an interview with Megan Kate Nelson for you. She's been on the show before. Go back in the archives and listen to our conversation about her book Ruination, which is sort of about the environmental devastation of the Civil War. In that conversation, she sort of teased us with the project that's out now, an incredible book that came out just a couple months ago called The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. It's so great to talk to her about this project because it's something that, it comes up in this conversation. Like, in the popular imagination, the Civil War is something very, very different than what it actually was. And what this book sort of shows us is by, relocating the action to the West, particularly New Mexico, we get to see what the Union and the Confederacy sort of encountered in the West with regard to Native Americans and how Native Americans navigated the world of the Civil War, both as a political and ideological thing and as a real military thing that was ripping its way through their land. It's an incredible story. Again, one you don't hear much about. And the sort of bottom line of it, and this is what we get to sort of throughout this whole conversation, is the deep, this is a very nostalgia trap thing, a very deep contradiction at the center of the American project. And that is, comes out very, very clearly in the Civil War, in which the American federal government is literally, fighting to end slavery and bring black people into the project of American liberty. At the same time, that same government and that same military is exterminating Native Americans. And not only that, but offering a sort of vision through a genocidal vision through which we can understand what happened afterwards. It's a really, really scary book. And again, one that I think more people ought to know about. And I think that's the whole project of Nostalgia Trap in part, is to sort of find scholars that are doing work that offer us mind-blowing reinterpretations of things we thought we knew. So I want to thank Megan Kate Nelson for talking with me about her book and her work. I really enjoyed it. If you enjoy our show and find it valuable, we need your support. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We have bonus episodes, live streams every Thursday on YouTube at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We talk with Justin Rogers Cooper about whatever is going on in the news that week, and there's plenty of stuff to chew on. But we're trying to sort of frame stuff in terms of the larger story of American capitalism and global capital, and how those things are flowing right now and how things are realigning really, really quickly in front of us. Speaking of Civil War, we have a lot of stuff to say about that as well. So come on by the live stream, support our show on Patreon at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thank you to all the folks that are doing that. Enjoy this interview. Here is me with the one and only Megan Kate Nelson. Hello, Megan. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. It's been a while. And actually, I don't think the last time I talked to you, I wasn't seeing you.
That's right.
There was no seeing.
Yeah, we are in that. I feel like the COVID Zoom thing, whatever it is, like has made us more, I don't know if the word comfortable, but everyone seems to be more willing to do video stuff than ever before in terms of the podcast. The podcast was always just the phone.
Yeah, and I mean, I've done some podcasts where it's just audio using other, like Zencaster and some other kinds of technologies. And then I've done them with video, and video can be nice because you actually feel like you're having a conversation and you're not just speaking into the void.
Yeah, it's weird. I could go either way on it, because sometimes on these podcasts I have fond memories, but doing it for so long of like, the zone you can go in where you're sort of talking to just the voice, and you're sort of like imagining. It's almost like reading a book. You've got like a different sort of thing going on. I'm getting used to it. But either way, last time we talked, I remember you were talking about this project that has now been published as a book. And I just wanted to, first of all, congratulate you on the publishing of your book, which is called The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the fight for the West. And I just want to say how jealous I am that you have many incredible blurbs on the back of this book, including from the Civil War god himself, James McPherson. And they all have wonderful things to say about your book. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was really nice to get all of those blurbs from Jim McPherson and David Blight and Joanne Freeman and Clay Risen, like a lot, and TJ Stiles, like a lot of writers and historians I really admire came on board. So that was lovely, and a lovely part of that whole production process.
I can imagine it's sort of, I mean, for me, it seems intimidating to write about the Civil War, because it seems like such a, when you say those names and you say like these it's a very, does it feel like a very established historiography, or what were your feelings about like going into write about the Civil War, and especially because you're sort of taking a different take on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had sort of had the experience of writing Ruination as my first Civil War book, and so that was really my leap into the fire, where I was pretty much a self-taught Civil War historian, because I had started out in Southern history and environmental history, and just kind of came to the Civil War for the second project. And so had never taken any classes in it. And so just started teaching it, which as you know, is like that is a brutal but very efficient way to get to know the historiography and the timeline, to teach it to students. But yeah, it was, when I started the Three Cornered War project, I felt like I had a pretty good sense of the trajectory of the Civil War in terms of timeline, in terms of its political and military and cultural components. But it's very true that not many people have written about the far West. I mean, I think we have a lot of books on the Western theater as it is known. I'm doing quotation marks, by the way.
And what is that? What does that mean for those that don't know? What is that Western? That in the older historiography, what is that Western theater?
That usually refers to the Trans-Mississippi. So all of the fights going on around Vicksburg and New Orleans, some Indian Territory material, Kansas and Missouri, and Arkansas. Tennessee, those kind of conflicts in that region are referred to as the West. And that became a big problem, right? Because when you're thinking about 40% of the nation's landmass, which extends from the Pacific coast, where you are, to the 100th meridian, that's a huge part of the nation. And the continent, and it is also a theater in and of itself, and it gets completely erased, because what can be west of the West, right? So I started calling it the Far West, or sometimes when I was feeling snarky, which I think you will totally agree with me on this point, I called it the real West. But yeah, I mean, Ari Kelman had written that great book about Sand Creek, and really, that was it. I mean, there were military histories that I relied upon a great deal, especially by Jerry Thompson, who is like the most amazing prolific. He's like the Earl Hess of Southwestern Civil War history, like just churning out book after book after book, and also doing a lot of really great primary document collection, which was tremendously helpful. But there hadn't really been any kind of academic book that was also narrative history, that was both deeply researched, but also telling a story of the conflict in this region, that brought together all of those different stories of Union troops, Confederate invasion, multiple Native peoples, and then Hispano-New Mexicans who are sort of in the mix, siding with the Union at this moment, but had, very complicated kind of perceptions of all of the different communities that were involved in this conflict. So, I had not ever done Western history before. So that was new. But it was great fun for me, because I grew up in the West also. I grew up in Colorado. And so I was able to go home. And I stayed with my parents, which of course, always exciting. While I was doing research in Denver at the Denver Public Library and the Colorado Historical Society, which is called History Colorado now. And then I did a 4-month driving tour of the Southwest and went to archives, went to university, special collections, went to almost all of the sites that are in the book, which many of which are saved and preserved as either state historic sites or state battlefields, or actually national battlefield parks.
It's just, I mean, so much that's striking about what you write about in this book is sort of like a different vision, even just visually, of what the Civil War looked like, from like an environment. Because I know you talk so much about sort of the natural, the quote unquote natural environment, right? So how does that change the vision of what fighting looks like? I mean, I'm imagining like even Civil War films, you know, that take place in Gettysburg. There's a certain sort of like landscape that's conjured in my mind. But when I'm thinking about like battles in New Mexico, what does that look like, and what did you encounter when you were out there? Because I imagine to me like going out into the desert is a thing we love to do when we living out here, and I've gone to the desert a lot. But it's always, what's striking to me is how it seems like how little the landscape has changed, you know, in some ways. You're kind of like, it's easier to imagine, like, I don't know, dinosaurs walking around here and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, the sort of landscape of the Civil War, because it seems like your story and your book is really, that's one of the things it does, is gives us a different picture of what the Civil War looked like in the terms of where it was being fought.
Yeah, good. And I'm glad. I've heard from a lot of readers that there are 9 different protagonists in the book. The narrative follows these 9 people kind of during their time in the Southwest during this conflict. And I've heard from a lot of readers that they think the desert is the 10th protagonist, the 10th character. Right. And I think that's really true, actually, because, and I think you know this, and anyone who lives in the West knows this, that the desert exerts a pressure on your body, on stuff you bring with you, your car, you know, like now your car, but at that time, wagons, all of your material, basically and for the armies moving through this region, it was, you know, they had mules and horses and wagons and their own bodies. And that's how they're moving forward through space. And they are getting progressively, most of them, higher and drier as they go. And it takes a toll on them in really interesting ways. Like there are some Confederate soldiers who are coming from East Texas, which if you've ever been there, that is low and wet, right? So they are moving westward, and the wagons that they had built in Eastern Texas start falling apart because the wood starts shrinking in that climate, and just, you know, it starts to fall apart. And so that's one thing. Their shoes were falling apart because, again, leather shrinking, like in that aridity and that high elevation. They found themselves unable to sleep. And anyone who has ever kind of gone to high elevations feels this, right? You have what we would talk about as altitude sickness, but what they just sort of registered as headaches, you know, not being able to sleep well. And when that happens, and of course, you know, they had some water, but often they were really depleted and dehydrated and drinking whiskey instead of water, which is never a good idea in the high desert. Yeah. And so that makes a difference in terms of the strength of your fighting force, right? So I think really where you see the desert as a more extreme factor in warfare in this region than I think you see it anywhere else. I mean, obviously, all wars are fought outside, basically, especially during this period. And soldiers are, you know, vulnerable to the elements wherever they are. There's weather everywhere. All soldiers are getting rained on and snowed on, and it's windy and they're exposed. But I think in the Southwest, it was just so extreme that it actually, the combination of the climate and then, you know, elevation, aridity, all of that, plus the huge distances they had to go between point to point. You know, pretty much every community in this book ends up on some kind of long march that is more than 400 miles.
Jesus.
And they're doing it mostly on foot, usually in some sort of inclement weather. It's either kind of wintry and therefore cold and surprising kind of blue norther type of weather, or it is summer and it is hot, like in the 90s and the hundreds. And so they're, dehydrated, they're passing out, they're dying on the road because of this. And so that combination of things really shaped the war itself. It made Union and Confederate troops really vulnerable to Chiricahua, Apache, and Navajo raiding. It made, sort of really kind of hurt Confederate manpower, which didn't affect them as much in the first battles of the conflict in 1862. But ultimately, when their wagon train was destroyed at Glorieta Pass, without horses and mules and without your wagons to take your provisions with you, you're basically dead right? Like if you lost your mode of transportation and water was 40 miles away, like you were likely not going to make it before you died. So
that's the fact of the desert for me always. Is even driving through the desert in my sort of air-conditioned automobile, 21st century car, I'm still thinking like, God, if the car breaks, I'm just in these elements in which death is coming. Like it almost feels like being, on the Titanic or something. Like the ocean is there and it's gonna. It seems like part of your story, I know I'm always making like connections to the Vietnam War, but it seems like part of your story there, it reminds me of like American soldiers or even French soldiers, sort of having the wrong equipment for the landscape in Vietnam and sort of, be encountering conditions that they weren't really prepared for. And those conditions, sort of their weakness in those conditions were exploited by the sort of indigenous forces that were there that knew how to survive in that and that seems like it's part of your story too. But I'm wondering, for people that have a sort of conception of the Civil War as sort of the North and the South, fighting on the eastern half of the United States, why are Confederate soldiers headed through New Mexico during this time? Why is that happening?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the driving questions for my research in the book, is why is there a war here in the first place, right? First of all, no one really kind of talks about it in Civil War history. So when I found out about it, and I had never learned about it growing up in Colorado, so I was like, first of all, what was going on here? Confederates invaded New Mexico in the kind of summer through the fall of 1861 for three reasons. One, they wanted ultimately to take the entire West, and the Southwest was kind of their gateway, because the far western edge of the Confederacy was, of course, West Texas at El Paso. And from there, during this time period, it was kind of a straight shot west to California through what was then just New Mexico territory, which is now both New Mexico and Arizona. And it was a long way, but it was a pretty straight shot. And so they figured if they could invade New Mexico territory, take the territory, then they could launch this fight for California. And they wanted California for its gold fields, because the Confederacy, of course, I mean, it takes money to fight wars, as everyone knows. And the Confederacy had way less money than the Union. And so they figured that if they could capture those gold fields, not only would they have the gold itself, but then, the gold would back other currency and create stability, and they could maybe sell Confederate war bonds and all this kind of stuff to raise money for the war. So gold was one reason. Pacific ports were another reason. And that was particularly important because even by the first summer of the war, those Union blockades of Confederate ports were starting to work. Like that was the only part of the Union campaign plan that was actually working by the summer of 1861. But they were starting to be quite successful at that. And the Confederate authorities were like, we need to find another outlet. We need to find a way to ship our cotton. And we need possibly ways to kind of get other war material to us. And so Pacific ports in California, the deep water ports in kind of San Diego, LA, and then San Francisco were, covetable targets.
Sure.
And they also were quite interested perhaps in, extending the Confederacy from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and then wooing Mexico into an alliance so that they could start moving materiel through Mexico as well, to get all the kinds of things that they needed that were being blockaded in the Atlantic and then also in the Gulf. So that was all part of the plan. And also the Confederacy had this vision that in this new kind of continental nation of the Confederacy, that this was going to be an empire of slavery, and that they were going to extend, because we always talk about the West and the expansion of slavery into the Western territories when we're talking about the coming of the Civil War, right? Like this is the whole, anyone who's ever taken a U.S. history survey class knows that what you're talking about basically from the Mexican-American War on is all the fights in Congress about whether slavery was going to be established in these new territories that had been won in war, that had been purchased, or kind of negotiated. And so the fact that then we just sort of ignore that whole thing once the war begins in the spring of 1861 is just sort of crazy, because of course they were still thinking about it. So the Confederacy had this kind of future vision of itself as this empire of slavery from coast to coast, and then possibly expanding south into Mexico and Central America, into the Caribbean. And that kind of national vision is really important. I mean, I think there are Civil War historians who've talked about this, about needing to have a kind of sense of the future and a sense of like what this nation is supposed to be, right? And of course, for the Union, they didn't want the Confederacy to have any of that, right? They wanted to keep control of the gold fields. They wanted to keep control of Pacific ports. They did not want Mexico allying themselves with the Confederacy. That was going to be a problem for them diplomatically. And then they had their own vision, which was an empire free of slavery, an empire of basically white laborers, and then after 1863, perhaps free Black laborers, kind of spanning the West, that whole manifest destiny vision that goes all the way back to Jefferson and his agrarian farmers.
I was going to say that it seems like the story you're telling is sort of about competing visions of manifest destiny. The Union and the Confederacy offering different sort of ideas about who was going to control the continent, but white men on either side of that. It seems like, and so I wonder what part of the story of the West. I mean, right now in the 1860s, that period is like contestation. It seems like it's not settled, like who has control of these Los Angeles ports and San Diego ports, and it seems like something that's in the process of happening. It seems like all of this is just like, I mean, I think that's part of why the Three-Cornered War is such a great title for your book, because it's like there are many forces that are sort of playing in the West right here, and you can sort of see parts of the ideology of the Civil War in ways that we haven't before. What is sort of the vision of the Confederacy in this sort of expansionist idea? Who are they going to be fighting? Because it seems like Native Americans are going to be in that vision. How are they sort of envisioning overcoming that barrier, to put it one way, strategically or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think white Southerners had the same vision of an approach to Native peoples as white Northerners, right? And white Midwesterners. All of them believed that the land in North America, basically, within the borders of the United States, belonged to white people, that it did not, and it belonged to the federal government, perhaps as public land, to be then surveyed and dispersed to white people, right? And so they did not see Native peoples as having any right to the land. They saw them as a vanishing people, and who would just give way in front of either Confederate or Union military might, right? And so, I mean, the Confederates were interesting because initially they did try to form alliances with some indigenous groups. And they did so in Indian territory, and actually did make very concerted and energetic diplomatic efforts there to kind of turn those 5 aligned tribes to the Confederacy. And some of them went, and some were quite divided. And so on the march west, I think first Baylor, who went in the summer of 1861 in order to establish a foothold, and then Sibley, who followed with an army of 3,000 Texans. They tried to kind of have treaty talks along the way, but ultimately they kept getting raided because they were, large groups of men strung out in a line with a lot of valuable horses and mules and other kinds of materiel. And this just seemed like a gift, right, to the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, for whom raiding was part of their economy that had been, part of that system for years and years. So they continuously raided and didn't consider that any alliances that any other tribal nation had signed potentially or discussed with the Confederacy applied to them at all. And so pretty quickly, the Confederates turned to extermination, which was, we would call it now genocide. They didn't really have that. They didn't have that term, but they did have the term extermination, and they used it. And what they meant by that is that they were going to make war upon indigenous peoples until they either killed them all or they killed all the men. And either for the Confederates, they were going to enslave the women and the children. The Union had a different kind of approach, but it also involved violent campaigns that centered on kind of hard war as the strategy. And their goal was to force Native peoples to surrender. And then they were going to forcibly remove them to reservations where they would be civilized or they would die, which is another kind of, it's a cultural extermination, right? Because they were going to try to convert them into Americans. And many white Americans didn't even think that was possible. So it's kind of the same end. But so they were united, both the Union and the Confederate troops in the region were united by this idea that they were going to take control of the West from one another, and then they were going to kind of wrest it from Native peoples. And that was really the approach. There was no diplomacy attempted after a certain point on either side. Yep.
I mean, during that diplomatic time period, though, I mean, is there, I know that you sort of take a look at individuals from Native tribes and sort of, I know it's sort of, not sort of, it's incredibly complicated, the different sort of attitudes about how, because I think a lot of people would imagine, like, well, why would a Native American tribe, why would they ally with the Confederacy, that has this sort of genocidal attitude? But can you give us a picture of sort of how complicated that is? Because it seems like a lot of this has to do with, just survival. But it seems like, that people that Native Americans would have understood that these were some of the terms of the debate. In other words, they would have understood that this fight was involving them and was a danger to them.
Absolutely, yes. And the tribal nations in this region, and the Three-Cornered War really focuses on 2 of them specifically, the Chiricahua Apaches, who are led by Mangus Coloradus and his son-in-law Cochise at this time, and then the Navajos, who are further north and who are led by numerous headmen, including Manuelito, who is the husband of Juanita, who is another one of the protagonists. And what characterizes, 2 things characterize kind of indigenous responses to this sort of huge, really quite huge upsurge in the number of soldiers in their midst. Like before this point, there had been scattered frontier garrisons of about a couple hundred soldiers each, but now there were thousands of soldiers kind of in the region. And they were fighting each other, but they were, at least initially, but that constituted a change. So one of the things, though, to note is that what constitutes kind of the Native response here is that it was very divergent across across the entire West and even the Southwest. some communities had no contact with Union and Confederate troops. Mm-hmm. Others, like the Chiricahuas and the Navajos, had very intensive contact. And so in some ways, the Three-Cornered War depicts a war that is fully a three-cornered war with Native peoples on war footing most of the time. But for many communities, that wasn't the case. Many communities established, they called them Pima and Maricopa peoples at the time, but they are now Acamel Odam, peoples living west of Tucson. That group did enter kind of diplomatic relations with both Confederate troops very briefly, and then especially with Union troops under James Carleton, who are coming from California, because they were the region's agriculturalists. They were growing wheat along the Gila River. They had been active in that trade for years. And so they made a deal with Carleton to basically become the first California's quartermasters along that road from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande. And so that was a very different kind of experience than Chiricahua, Apaches, and Navajos had. But even within that, and this is where we see Mangus Coloradus was really the best at this. He saw every situation as individual. So just because he had attacked American wagon trains before didn't necessarily mean he was going to do it again, or he was going to continue to do it for years. At certain points, he chose diplomacy. At certain other points, he chose kind of toll taking, where he would say, yes, you can move through my land if you give me certain things. Other time, they didn't really establish treaty making necessarily, but he was open to it. And so this is the other thing. Not only did Native experiences vary within the region, they often varied within each community from time period to time period, kind of depending on what the situation was. Because most Native groups in their warfare strategy, they used the environment to their advantage. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they knew that they never wanted to, and they never did attack troops that were stronger than them in numbers. They would never have taken 200 of their fighting men and attacked a force of 1,000. They just never would have done it. Because that was a losing proposition to them. And so
it again sounds like an insurgency, and it sounds like it sounds like the strategies. I mean, obviously, I'm not a lot of people writing about the Vietnam War make connections between the sort of the quote unquote Indian wars. But it seems like, I mean, your book is like, you should be developing into a Netflix series, because it's like they're so it's such a setting for this sort of dynamic, complicated politics. It's like a Game of Thrones, but American style. But one of the things that's striking to me, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, which is that part of the reason there are no airplanes, right? I mean, it's a kind of obvious point, but this is a passageway. Like, this is a road. This is like a big interstate, in one way or another through New Mexico to get to the prize of California, which has the water and the agriculture and the gold and so many other things, and the sunshine.
Yes.
But I mean, and a desert seems like this foreboding place that you got to pass through to just like get out of and get from one place to another. But the desert also becomes a place where people settle, and I'm wondering, like, I'm partly wondering about like how that develops in terms of the idea of like, let's settle here, like white people specifically. What are they going to do there in the desert? Because to me, it's like they retire near Vegas. That's my 21st century vision of it. But what were they doing then? Like, what can you grow in the desert, sort of thing?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there were multiple major river valleys. So there's the Rio Grande Valley. There's the Gila, and then there's the Colorado River further west. And those areas had fairly significant agricultural zones kind of around them. But, as living in the West, water is the thing, right? Like, how much water do you have? Where can you get it? Indigenous peoples, and then later Spanish and then Mexican migrants had created a system of irrigation ditches in order to plant the crops that they needed to survive. And so that was already in place. So this was the first time that white Americans had ever seen irrigation. And I think I mentioned before the 100th meridian, and that's the line that environmental historians use to demarcate the West, because that's the line at which, to the west, there are fewer than 20 inches of rainfall in a year. And so agriculture requires irrigation. Like you have to have it in order to actually plant to survive on any kind of considerable acreage. So Native peoples had been using irrigation. They had also been planting all kinds of crops that are actually, environmentally sustainable. And Navajos in particular were agriculturalists. Chiricahua Apaches were not. They were more hunters and they were more nomadic. Navajos had more kind of, they would move from place to place, but they were pretty kind of, I don't want to use the word settled, but they were established places where they would spend particular seasons where they had agricultural fields, and they also had huge sheep herds. So herding was a major driver of the economy during this period for both indigenous communities and then also Hispano communities in New Mexico and Arizona. Can you hold on for just one second? I don't know if you can hear this. My cat is like freaking out right now.
No worries.
Hold on for one brief second. I'll be back. Talking about herding animals.
Go for it.
Oh my God. Sorry about
No worries.
That. This is the danger of the meeting. She was sitting so nicely, like up on her little cat bed, and then she just her brother came to get her, and so she was freaking out.
I was doing a live stream last month, and my cat, I said, I'll leave her in the room because she's sleeping, and I don't want to bother her. And she slept the entire live stream, and then when they're about 45 minutes into it, she got up and decided to vomit all over, very performatively. And that was the end of the show. And so it was the lesson that even if they're peaceful at the beginning of the podcast, they might not be the whole time.
Yeah. And we have had that demonstrated here today. At least she didn't she did not throw up. So that was good. But yeah, so herding is one of the major things. But there was also agriculture in the major river valleys. Where they could have access to water. They hadn't really been, there was some well digging, but not extensively. So they were still pretty dependent on either springs or streams, or again, the kind of larger rivers in the region. One of the major extractive industries that both Hispanos and Anglos participated in, and to maybe a few indigenous communities, but not really, was gold mining and copper mining and other metals. And there was a major gold rush in Arizona in 1863, which is part of what motivates James Carleton, who's now in charge of troops and defending the West from both Confederates and natives. It really convinces him that he needs to launch campaigns against both Chiricahua Apaches and Navajos, because their territories sort of encompass and surround the gold fields of Arizona. And so any miners who want to go to these gold fields have to cross through either Apacheria or Dinebekea, which is the Navajo homeland. So Carleton then put into motion these campaigns to exterminate or remove both of those communities, to make way for miners. So mining communities were really, there had already been a lot of mining communities established in the region. And in fact, in Colorado, that's why there were so many men who were able to sign up for the Union Army. And this is one of the arguments in the book that I became quite fond of, is this connection between gold rushes and Union campaigns to secure the West.
I was wondering, because it's you set this area up as sort of this important passageway to valuable stuff, but it seems like along the way we learn that there's also there are resources and things that and regions that are valuable of the on their own.
Yes, and it's no coincidence that the southern route that kind of moved between Mesilla on the Rio Grande to Los Angeles, and then the more northerly route, which was kind of moved up through what became Wyoming territory, and then went to Salt Lake, and then moved west over to California. Those were the first two routes of the transcontinental railroads, right? So these are major thoroughfares, but there are communities along the way because you need those way stations, first of all. And there are, this is mountainous country. It is mineral country. And so this is the era of gold strikes and rushes and, huge loads being discovered. And Americans are still very susceptible to that. It's a very strong, that kind of dream of striking it rich in that way is almost as powerful as manifest destiny, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about GameStop right now. Everyone wants to get in on that.
That's right.
Right? Everyone wants it. I mean, it's. I am imagining so this flood of white people, and being a Californian, always growing up with this sort of 49ers idea, sort of like the 1849 gold rush, and I grew up going to Knott's Berry Farm and learning how to pan gold, and there's all this sort of like memories now I have of my childhood that were just history memories that are now like sort of settler colonial memories in my mind, and things like that. But I wonder, because one of the things we notice in California is Confederate flags, and we're always sort of like, oh, why are there Confederate flags in California? Civil War was in Mississippi or something, but it seems like that ideology, oftentimes, like my parents used to say, well, that's because people came during the Great Depression from the South, and that's why they're here. But you're identifying something much further back, and I'm wondering, sort of. What are there Confederate stronghold towns in California? Are there places where the white settlers? Because I mean, at this point, you have developed, white communities that are kind of split along Union and Confederate lines. It seems like that's what's happening here.
Absolutely. A lot of the mining towns across the West were pretty evenly divided between kind of Northerners, Midwesterners, and Southerners. They kind of came over in these streams. They either, took the boat route through South America or Central America, or they came overland. And so a lot of these, even larger towns like Denver, San Bernardino was kind of a little iffy in the beginning. And, Los Angeles and San Francisco were a little bit more kind of solidly in the Union camp, as it were. But pretty much all of the mining towns throughout the West, it was a real toss-up at the beginning. And there were actively fights at flagpoles where Southerners are trying to take down the U.S. flag and like raise like some semblance of the Confederate flag, which didn't exist in its current form until a little bit later. But, they're trying to sort of express their loyalty to this new nation. And, some people weren't having it. There were gunfights like in Taos, in Denver, trying to gain control of these places. And one of the stories that I was just really charmed by that I tell briefly in the book is that one of the protagonists, Alonzo Ickes, who is from Iowa and came for the Colorado Gold Rush of 1859 and was still there in 61. He was up in Breckenridge, which, if you've been in the West and you're a skier at all, you've heard of Breckenridge. And that town was actually first named by a Kentucky miner who was there in honor of John C. Breckenridge, who was a Democrat candidate for president in 1860, running against one of the three people running against Lincoln for various parties. And he had then aligned himself with the Confederacy and become an officer. And he spells his name with an I in the Breckenridge. And so the miners of Breckenridge, who the Northerners outnumbered the Southerners, decided in a miners' vote to change the spelling of the name so that it would no longer be named after John C. Breckenridge, who to them was a traitor, right? So that's why
they're gonna get back at him by changing one letter of the name of the town. Yeah,
yes. But
take that.
Yeah, this was the thing. I think we've had a very recent discussion about and fight about whether to rename Confederate forts. Totally.
And it's happening. Your story there is like it's happening during the Civil War.
Exactly. During the Civil War. So when people are talking about this, I'm like, Union soldiers knew who the traitors were. Like,
right.
And so there was a fort in New Mexico that was named after a guy who resigned his commission and went to the Confederacy. And so they renamed it. And they were just like, nope. Not going to be Fort Fauntleroy anymore.
Wow.
And they renamed it during the war. And they named it after a fallen Union soldier.
It's so funny because on the one hand, part of my cynical sensibility is like, oh, you're just renaming things. Who cares? You can just rename it. It's still but then on the other hand, it's just like it's important, and it seems like it's playing a really critical role in the way people conceive of like the whole ideological project.
And it was, and for soldiers, these are sites, these are garrisons where they live, and those names have meaning to them. Mm-hmm. And they are usually named after, either soldiers who have died or officers who have had a very long kind of military career and have established themselves and as American patriots. And once those guys started resigning their commissions and going and reporting to Richmond, they just were like, nope. We are not going to serve in this space that has the name of a traitor attached to it.
You can feel that tension right now. I feel like people would say, like, I'm not going to go anywhere where, that's named after Ted Cruz,
Is there anything named after Ted Cruz?
There will be eventually. But you know what I mean? Like, it feels like that tension is there. I mean, I know that's a whole other story about the Civil War, but I mean, it's hard not to make those connections, particularly when like people in Congress are tweeting about violence,
Yeah. Well, and there's also debate, and I've written about this a fair bit, but there's a monument to Union soldiers in Santa Fe. Well, now there's only a third of a monument because part of it has come down in resistance and protest actions. But the obelisk was erected to Union soldiers, and it explicitly lauds them for their campaigns against Confederates and against Native peoples.
Well, That's what I wanted to.
Word usage. Yeah,
that's what is absolutely key that we get to. Is sort of this one argument that I think is so critical and brings your work into sort of talking about the contradictions of American life all the way to today. And it's this amazing sentence that I just want to read a quote from your book, Megan, that says, "The struggles for power in the West exposed a hard and complicated truth about the Union government's war aims, that they simultaneously embraced slave emancipation and native extermination in order to secure an American empire of liberty." That's an incredible quote, and I wondered because we've talked a lot about sort of Confederates in the West, but how is, because there's all this fighting going on, how is the Union government going to come in and sort of like wrangle all this into the larger sort of military operation we think of as the Civil War?
Right. Yeah. So after Carleton and Canby sort of sufficiently shoved the Texans back to where they came from. Canby left, was reassigned, went to the east, and Carleton took over. And from that point on, he focused solely on campaigns against Native peoples. And he had permission for that. And in some ways, he sort of acted without orders, and he would just inform his superiors. But he was the head of the Department of New Mexico. He was allowed to make his own decisions. Plus, to get any kind of order would have taken a month, given the fact that there were no trains past the Missouri River, and that there was no telegraph line in that region at all. So any kind of request for orders was going to take too long in most of these these officers' estimation. So he did act technically without orders, but his campaigns were approved. They were funded. Abraham Lincoln himself signed the order creating Bosque Redondo, which is a reservation to which the Union Army removed almost 10,000 Navajos and about 400 Mescalero Apaches during the Civil War, and basically incarcerated them in what we can consider to be a prisoner of war camp, because Carleton considered them to be prisoners, right? And he called them prisoners the whole time that he was in command. He did not think of them as kind of reservation Indians who he was going to civilize. He thought of them as his property to surveil and to contain. And so that is part of the whole Union vision, right? And I think we have a hard time processing that because we're so used to thinking about Lincoln and the Union cause as being besmirched, right? That ultimately they are fighting for Black rights, for Black freedom, for the end to slavery, for civil rights, perhaps even equal rights. And we don't like to think about these, as I call them, hard truths, that the Union was also acting explicitly in a settler colonial mode. And I mean, what's interesting to consider is that pretty much right after they got the news that the Union had successfully turned back the Confederate invasion of the Southwest, the US Congress passed the Homestead Act, the Mora Land Grant Act, and the Pacific Railway Act, which had been acts that they had wanted to pass in the 1850s, but they had never been able to because Southern power was so strong. But all of those acts take land away from Native people and give it to white people. So it basically is a land grab. All three of those pieces of legislation, which Lincoln signed and which he talked about in all of his annual addresses. I think we also need to think about the fact that basically within the same week, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and also signed the death warrants for Dakota men who had participated in the uprising in their Dakota territory and Minnesota territory.
This is one of the largest mass hangings. Yes. Is that right? That you're referring to?
The largest mass execution in American history. Was 38 Dakota men who had, part of a larger uprising and sort of fight against U.S. soldiers in the upper Midwest. And the Dakota lost that fight and suffered very much for it. And hundreds of them were actually imprisoned and 300 of them were sentenced to death. But Lincoln kind of took a look at it and commuted most of their sentences, but then said, these 38 should be put to death for war crimes, basically. So you've got, this is within the same week, right? Yeah, so we're thinking about, he's acting to protect, for Black freedom and then for Native extermination, all within, certainly now, a sort of national vision of unification. Yes. Almost a sort of vision of healing. When people think of Abraham Lincoln, they think of the person that stitched the nation back together. And when you look at it from the perspective of Native Americans, I know it's sort of hard to make big judgments like this, but it seems almost like a final phase in the sort of process of negotiation of what role Native Americans will play in that nation. Yes. And it seems like the period of time and the conflicts you're writing about is them being finally written out of it in the West. Yeah. Well, yeah, and when we think about the three major legislative achievements, constitutional achievements of the Civil War, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, the 14th Amendment explicitly denies citizenship to Native people unless they are living off of their homeland and paying taxes. If they're doing that, then they can be considered citizens. But that was such a small percentage of the indigenous population that functionally the 14th Amendment provided equal rights to everyone but Native people.
Ugh.
So, I mean, this is one of these things when you look at these moments that usually we're so proud of in American culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's very hard. I understand the resistance to it. I understand people who are saying, no, this isn't right. Like, this can't be right. And I'm like, oh, but it was right. Like, that's,
That mythology is so powerful. The Civil War comes up a lot on this show for various reasons, but one of the reasons is sort of like the mythology of good and evil and righteous justice. Even the idea of I don't know, a lot of young people from our generation sort of watching movies like Glory or the Ken Burns thing and sort of engaging in this romantic idea. I mean, it makes me actually think now, like, how much did Ken Burns talk about Native Americans? I don't know.
Not at all.
Big Zero?
Zero.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Because, I mean, honestly, and I'm your book, Megan, and I know it's part of a historiography that I think there are a number of writers that you refer to that are sort of in the West and telling this story. But to me, it's like it's the whole thing, because it reveals that contradiction, which is like, how do you make a nation that is this anti-slavery, progressive nation? There's always winners and losers when you're making a nation. And
absolutely.
And that's that's the story you tell here. I mean, it's an incredible book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for writing it. Do you know what's next?
Yes, actually, I am about to finish the next book, which is a little bit nuts.
That is nuts.
Yeah, it will have been 90% researched and 80% written during quarantine, which is yeah. I mean,
I wondered about that because the Three-Cornered War is based on research that you did in a big trip. I'm wondering if that would even be possible. I mean, that's an episode that we should talk about because doing on Nostalgia Trap, because we talk about methodology. I don't know if that would bore people to tears, but it's kind of tricky in terms of archival work. It seems like in COVID, it's a different kind of thing.
I don't think people would be bored by it, actually. Most of the time when I've given talks on the Three-Cornered War, people have a lot of questions about, how did I find these sources?
Cool.
Where did I find them? Like, what are they? What do they look like? Excuse me. And it is true, as an environmental historian, one of my methodologies is site visits. And I was not able to do that for this new book, which tells the story of the 1871 scientific survey to Yellowstone, which led directly to the passage of the Yellowstone Act in 1872, which created the first national park in the world. And I was interested in this story, not only because it's, in many ways an environmental one, and it's a cultural one. It's about a lot of issues that I am continually interested in. But I wanted to tell this story in a way that it hasn't been told before, which is in the context of Reconstruction. So, why is this happening? Why does Congress choose to save Yellowstone in 1872, like right in the middle of Reconstruction? How does the West fit in to this national picture? So in a way, it's a kind of sequel to the Three-Cornered War. It is also taking a kind of moment in American history that we think of as being solely about the North and the South, and solely about white Americans and Black Americans. And it is taking that story and sort of refiguring it and giving us a different vantage point on it so that we see that actually Reconstruction was a national story, and that it also involved Native people, and that indigenous claims to sovereignty and their protection of their own land and their rights to the land actually shaped a lot of the major moments in Reconstruction history that I don't think we've really talked about. That sounds great. I mean, it seems like it's in line with your other work, which is in part about environmental history, but also it seems like you're interested in reperiodizing and sort of thinking about phenomenon that might be outside of the eras that we've previously marked them in. With that one, I'm thinking like, when you think about national parks, Teddy Roosevelt in the 20th century comes to mind, And I always, and even in my head here, I'm sitting here thinking like, well, I would tell the story of national parks with Teddy Roosevelt and this sort of like 20th century sort of vigorous imperial ideology, but God, to attach it to Reconstruction sounds awesome. That's really great. Yeah. So that it's been interesting to write about it kind of from just my own house.
Yep.
It has provided, I felt like I've traveled a fair bit just on the page, at least I've been able to kind of read about Yellowstone and look at photographs of Yellowstone and look at, all kinds of interesting maps of Lakota territory, which comes into play quite often. And I also have been able to go back to my roots as an American studies scholar, because one of the major components of this survey was the presence of William Henry Jackson, the photographer, and Thomas Moran, the painter. And they are two of probably the most prominent artists of this period who really shaped people's ideas about what the West was and what it is. But I was also very interested in why Yellowstone, right? It is a weird, I don't know if you've been, but it is a weird place. And in fact, one of the early trappers in the region, who was a guide, called it where hell bubbled up.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I was really interested, like, here is this place that is so dangerous where you don't really know what lies beneath your feet. And that space is now preserved for the nation and seen as an iconic American landscape,
right.
Which I think is actually really fitting, because what is a better metaphor for Reconstruction than where hell is bubbling up, right?
Yeah.
Everything looks fine, and then suddenly it explodes.
And the ground is unstable.
Yes.
Right? And shifting always.
And hollow. Yeah. And you can fall through at any moment. Which,
that does sound like American studies stuff. And I was going to mention that because so much of the history of Western films, like cowboy movies in the 50s. I mean, they're playing with a lot of this ideology, and so much of it is about like sort of the fallout from the Civil War. And there's all these sort of allusions to that world that it's weird because it's a world we don't really know all that much about.
Right.
It doesn't really fit into our cultural imagination of the Civil War. But Megan Kate Nelson, thank you so much for joining us. This was really fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on. This has been great.
And come back again and talk to us about Yellowstone.
Oh, yes. I'll come back next year.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, I think that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Megan Kate Nelson. Go get her book, The Three-Cornered War, The Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. It is a fantastic addition to the historiography of the Civil War, and something that more people ought to know about, and sort of put into the larger understanding of what this country is, and the contradictions that it contains, because it's just unbelievable stories and information in this book. And I thank her for writing it, and thank her for coming and talking to me about it. I appreciate everyone who's supporting the show on Patreon. At a time like this, when I don't know what the future holds in terms of classes for each semester, it really means a lot to have supporters. So if you've ever thought of supporting the show, now would be a great time to do that. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And we'll talk to you very soon. Take care. See ya.